Austin. I'm from RDFZ.
And I'm Mona, also from RDFZ. The contracted speech starts now. We negate the resolution. Unbalanced refugee restrictions in developed countries are permissible. We define refugees as someone owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or event seriously disturbing public order in his country of origin is compelled to leave his place of habitual residence in order to seek refuge in another place outside his country of origin in the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees. We define restrictions as those regulating the refugees more than foreign nationals. Test. If we prove that the status quo is problematic and current restrictions are not permissible, we win this debate. Condition 1, moral responsibility. A. Developed countries are hosting most of the refugees and developed countries are not evade their responsibilities. According to the 2017 global report from the UNHCR, 85% of the world's refugees are hosted by developing regions. Lebanon continued to host the largest number of refugees relative to its national population, where 1 in 5 people were a refugee. The number of resettlement opportunities available to refugees has decreased, and international refugee aid has also decreased, with the Trump administration leading, proposing to slash the budget by 1/3. B. Developed countries created instability and therefore have a moral obligation towards refugees. According to Professor John Kovas from Indiana University, although under a correct dictatorship, Libya under Gaddafi was relatively stable, as was Syria and Iraq, compared with after Western military intervention. Gaddafi had managed to keep their country unified. However, after the US, France, and the UK toppled the Gaddafi regime, the country was left deeply divided and in perpetual chaos in every sector from the political arena to the economy, resulting in millions of refugees fleeing for the West. Developed countries who contributed to the destabilization policy ought to compensate for their actions. Contingent 2, legal obligation. It is important to note that refugee protection is not a matter of solidarity or generosity. It is an obligation under international law. As Professor Alex Cohn, University of Wisconsin stated in 2018, by international law, current U.S. refugee restrictions violate non-refoulement, just covenants, and non-discrimination requirements. U.S. policy has heightened efforts to limit and restrict refugee right of entry in the and the 2017 Muslim ban. This order imposed a temporary ban on the entry of all nationals from 7 Middle Eastern countries and specified an indefinite ban on the entry of all Syrian refugees. There is an obligation on states not to frustrate the exercise of the right of asylum in such a way as to leave individuals at risk of persecution. Judge Coggins refers to the most fundamental and overriding principles of international law. As part of a legal obligation to prevent genocide and other crimes against humanity, which are clearly recognized as Judge Coggins crimes, states arguably have a duty to offer asylum to refugees fleeing these crimes. It is also important to note that the executive order breached non-discrimination requirements in Article 33 of the Refugee Convention and Article 26 of the RCCPR. Contention 3, economy. A. Jobs and wages for both refugees and natives. Kalina Cordes, a professor at Texas A&M University, followed refugee and non-refugee immigrants who arrived in the U.S. in the late 1970s and found that soon the refugees were out-earning non-refugee immigrants and adding more value to the economy each year than the original cost of receiving and reselling them. In the longer run, refugees appear to play an outsized role in creating new jobs and even raising the wages of natives. B. Countries are economically capable. According to the World Bank, Turkish economy will expand by 3% in 2015 and by 4% next year. Lebanon and Jordan's economy is also growing. These figures make the point that even in Turkey, which has received more refugees than any other country in the world, this cost has proved manageable. The Turkish government has spent 5.4 billion euros entirely funded through its own fiscal resources, and there is no indication that it has jeopardized the country's fiscal sustainability. Therefore, we proudly negate. Thank you.
Hello. Before I start, I want to appreciate everyone who supports me, especially my mom and my partner who has been with me for so long. Thank you. Just ready? Opponents ready? So process big one, time starts now. We affirm the resolution. On balance, refugee restrictions in developed countries are permissible. Framework, we urge a critical firm debate that is based on the destructive framework. We should decide whether refugee restrictions are permissible in developed countries by value philosophy principle in refugee restrictions. Definition. Refugee restrictions means background check on refugees is allowed. Nations can refuse anyone who is not demanded to national interest. Condition 1. National interest. Subpoint A. National security. According to Oxford Dictionary, national security refers to the security of the nation, including the citizen, economy, food, ecosystem, cyber, institutions, and is regarded as the duty of government. As refugees enter developed nations, reported by the Center for Global Development in July 2018, nations need to spend over $80,000 per refugees for the first few years, and nearly one-third of the national sources. Western security officials also fear some among the refugees have nefarious intentions, because a sense of disenchantment that developed countries cannot provide what they are really seeking for could become dangerous. And these sentiments and the potential for fear-mongering make refugees an even more attractive target for recruitment by extreme organizations like the ISIS, who see the crisis as an opportunity to further degrade any sense of unity among the Western world. Like they are trying to get WNB for at least a decade and view the Western world as the primary target. Thus, restrictions can greatly reduce the potential harm. Subpoint B, economy. According to a new study released by FAIR, taxpayers is being asked to feed, clothe, and shelter them. In addition to funding job training programs, which cost about $8.8 billion every 5 years, getting application for refugee states, processing immigration applications, and transporting approved application for the developed nations is needed. Also, the sudden movement of over 1 million people from Middle East to EU raised the unemployment rates for local workers by about 1/5 of a percentage point. Condition 2, restriction necessary. UN appeals for Syrian refugees have been grossly underfunded. Europe's chaotic and divided response to them has shaken the very foundation of Europe. Its fate idea made by French philosopher Jacques Derrida of hospitality. He concluded that All the acts of hospitality eventually lead to struggling between the need to sustain self-interest of both host, developed nations, and guest refugees, and the difficulty of determining who is a refugee and the criteria for guaranteeing such states often result in decisions made on biases. Marine Le Pen, the leader of France's far-right National First Party, recently cited images showing that most male refugees as evidence that men who flee from the country and leave their families and not flee from persecution is created for economic intentions. Contention 3, sovereignty. Sovereignty can be described as the ability of the system to meet its long-term fixed expansions and to accomplish long-term expansion growth. The refugee restrictions is the best way to enhance the sovereignty for developed nations. According to the Global Development Center, nations without restrictions on refugees will attract a huge number of them to flee to these countries. And that would certainly break the society balance in any nation and decrease, even eliminate the sovereignty. In the end, the nation will face situations like inflation, civil war, famine, and so on. Thus, we will further resolution. Thank you. Judge ready? Opponents?
Yeah.
So time starts now.
Okay, I believe I have the first question. So, firstly, why would the refugees be radicalized and become terrorists if they are in the developed countries?
I'll clarify your question.
Under our rule, the refugees will be living in developed countries, and why would they be recruited by, say, ISIS, as you mentioned in your contention?
Like I mentioned in my contention 1, that's a stance of disenchantment that developed countries can't provide for what they are really seeking for. Will make them disappointed, and that could make them dangerous for the recruitment organizations.
Why would not developed countries provide good living conditions for the refugees?
Good conditions. Just like I mentioned in my condition 2 about the hospitality theories, which means that actually the hospitality will actually eventually lead to struggling between the host and the guest, which means that they will all suffer from how to maintain the self-interest for both developed countries and the refugees. And move to my question. Could you please show me the unnecessity of the restrictions?
I'm sorry.
Show me the unnecessity of the restrictions.
Some basic restrictions are absolutely necessary.
Okay, okay, I got it. So you absolutely agree that
we're not agreeing.
The basic restrictions are actually permissible. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay,
but first, I'd like to mention that we are not agreeing with your framework because there has to be some kind of basic restrictions on the
move to your question, please.
Okay, so you said in your contention and also replied to my question with your hospitality argument. But however, as I mentioned in my contention, international law is a legal obligation, and therefore any arguments about hospitality should not stand.
Okay, so you mean that international clearly points out that developed nations shouldn't have restrictions on refugees? Is that true?
No, of course not. I'm saying that
show me the connection between international law and the refugee restrictions.
International law specifically regulates that the countries have an obligation to help refugees and accept refugees.
Yes, on our side, we also agree that we should help the refugees, but we help the refugees in a better way with the restriction, like I mentioned before, the security check. And my partner will address these points in his rebuttal. And move to my question. Could you please clarify your framework about your state code? Like, what is the actual state code you're talking about?
You mean the status quo?
Yeah. Clarify these points.
Are you asking me to explain what the status quo is right now?
Just clarify your framework again.
Our framework is that if we prove that the status quo is problematic and current restrictions are not permissible, we win this debate, which means that any reason our current restrictions could be bad is a reason to vote con.
Okay. Thank you.
my opponents ready? Okay, my time starts now. First, I would like to reaffirm that any reason why the current restrictions are not permissible is a reason to vote con. We do not have to defend that there should be no restriction. First, in the real world education, no one in the real world says there should be no restriction. Therefore, we don't need to defend zero restrictions. Second ground, the con will have absolutely no arguments if they have to defend zero restrictions. 3. Topic intent. The frames of the resolution writes that the importance of this topic is the current restrictions, not the abstract world of no restrictions. First, I would like to reaffirm the status quo. The status quo is that the refugees are living in inhumane living conditions. We are telling you that the refugees are facing an inhumane living condition with strict borders of the developed country. According to our source in 2016, a global crisis of displaced person is risking the lives of 65 million people and is increasing by 50% annually. And according to recent study, in such refugee camps, refugees often suffer from serious health risks, partition from their neighbors, and economic difficulties because of unemployment and mental health strains from all of the above. And first, let's move to our opponents' first contention. They mentioned national interest. Yes, we as a con team, that is exactly why we are taking in refugees to developed countries, because we want to defend national interest. By taking in refugees into the developed country, they will actually take up the jobs that the local citizens aren't capable or aren't willing to do. There are 7 million jobs in America that no one is taking up. Because we invited the refugees into our country, they can actually do these jobs because of specialization. And this way, it will benefit the economy, and actually it's in the favor of national interest. For when we think we defended this point, so this point doesn't stand. Also, they're saying the resettlement costs 18,000. However, I could give you an even larger figure. Let's just say the resettlement cost 18,000. However, according to another scholar in 2018, the resettlement in cheap country can cost 4 million. However, the refugee can create a benefit of $2 billion to the host country. So if they think that compared to the $2 billion that the refugee can actually generate to the home country, 4 million is a rather large figure. I don't quite understand their point. Second, if they're saying the restrictions are necessary, we've never said that we're eliminating all the restrictions. Just like I've mentioned, first of all, the con will have absolute no stand if we're defending for zero borders. So let's move back to our contention. We're saying that under the international law, the developing country, have the moral and legal responsibility to accept refugees. This is already agreed by the UNHCR and the United Nations. And so if you believe that the status quo is problematic and we should lessen some of the restrictions to defend national interests to benefit the economy overall, that is the reason to vote for con. And second, we're saying that the current restrictions are only benefiting they are not benefiting anyone. First, I would like to say it is very hard under the current restriction to actually resettle the refugees. The resettlement of the current refugee take up 18 to 24 months, and that is the part that the pro think that is cost the most, that burdens the home country's economy, because 18 to 24 months, that is a rather long period of time, and that is the exact part where the refugee are burdening the home country. So we're saying we should lessen the time to lessen some of the restrictions instead of just letting the refugees flee to any country anytime they want. So restrictions are actually, the restrictions and inequality cause an increase in terrorism doesn't stand, because the refugees are being terrorized by local people due to these restrictions, because they're currently living in camps and living in different conditions than their home nations. So they're being terrorized by the local people because they have no equality between the refugees and native people. So that is another reason I think you guys should vote for con. Thank you.
Speech starts now. Okay, first, Judge, let's check our opponent's framework. Their framework states that if they can prove there are some bad restrictions, therefore all restrictions should not be permissible. We totally disagree, because this is an unfair burden to us. But we believe that even if we have some bad policies, the best way is not to remove all those policies. Instead, we make them straight and make those policies that are beneficial for the refugees. Now let's move on. Our opponents state that if we can prove that restrictions are more than the foreign nationals, therefore restrictions are restrictions. But that is totally true. Because according to Canadian Free Beacon, all those refugees coming to this country, they will get a security check conducted by 3 governmental departments. This is extra and onerous security check for the refugees, therefore limiting and restricting on their rights to enter in these countries. And now let's move on. And about their first contention, they talks about 85% of refugees living in developed country and the cost of war. Therefore, the developed countries should bear more responsibility. We totally agree. We never said that we do not want the refugees to come. But I want to clarify one thing: with restriction, doesn't mean that we're putting all the refugees out of our country. And we believe our opponents, they themselves in the crossfire, they stated that some basic check and restriction are permissible. Therefore, in order to prevent the terrorism, we should have the security check. Because now currently, as our opponent stated, there are terrorist attacks just because of the restriction. And I believe if without restriction, the world will be the heaven for terrorists. Therefore, restriction should definitely be permissible. And now let's move on to our opponent's second contention. It talks about the obligation and some terrorists may cause war. But also, it talks about the 1951 Convention. But also in 1951 Convention, they stated that all the refugees that enter in the host country should obey the law in that country. And I believe this is reasonable and rational. Because if the refugees enter in this country without any restriction, I believe this will pose a large, detrimental effect to the host countries. Now let's move on. Our opponents talks about the economic benefit, but that is not true. Because the cultural and the religious differences, refugees do not produce an economic benefit in certain countries. According to our refugee diplomatic organizations, countries with more rigid policies see unemployment rate rise after receiving refugees. And in 1956, the Hungarian refugees fleeing to Australia produced a 3% increase in the Australian population, who become an enormous fiscal burden. The German newspaper had us explain that 95% of the refugees arrive in Germany, they do not speak German, and also the government have already spent 1.2 billion euro on language course for them. But actually, this is not the problematic nature of the restriction, but is the cultural and language barrier. Therefore, on our side, we propose a better way to help the refugees by by sending them to the developing country. What we're saying is that we do not encourage refugees goes to the developed country, but that doesn't mean that we refuse refugee. And by this way, we can better help the refugees, because according to Western news, for every $1 that invested on the refugees, it will produce a 2.13 of the net economic benefit to the countries. Therefore, those countries, developing countries, they have enough incentives. So if we let the developed countries sending them cash, which is a better way, and let the developing countries develop their economy and also help the refugee, I believe this is the win-win situation. And also, according to the National Review Institution, 20% of all the refugees are actually refugees, because another 80% of them are actually economic migrants. Therefore, we want this restriction to differentiate them between the economic migrants as well as the terrorists, between the refugees. Therefore, all those foreign aids and humanitarian aids can actually properly apply to those people who are really in need. Therefore, those restrictions can also help the home nation where refugees are from. Because just if you let's think in this way, if all the people, when there are conflict happening in their country, and they use the title of refugee and fleeing to other countries, how will the economy in their home country will be? Therefore, I believe restriction and reasonable restrictions should be permissible. And if we have bad policies, we should fix them. Thank you.
So I believe I have the first question.
Yes.
So how are you planning to resettle the refugees?
Okay, as I mentioned before, restriction is just a way to do not encourage them. Therefore, if they want to come into the developed country as stated in the Declaration of Human Rights, certainly we'll encourage them to go. But the reason why we do not encourage them
I'm
is
sorry,
because...
but that is not my question. My question was, how are you planning to resettle them? Where are they staying now?
They are staying now is not the place that you describe as the refugee camp, but largely in the developing country and also the developed country. Those two countries are actually share this burden together. But for the developed countries, they are more longer. The distance is longer for the refugees. Therefore, we provide a better solution to let them relocate in the developing nation, which they have the similar language, cultural background, which shows that they can actually easily get the job. Can I have my question?
Yeah, please.
Okay, my question is, you talked about the economic benefit and the wage increase. And how much wage can be increased in the developing countries?
I just stated that you use $4 million to resettle the refugees, right? And it could increase a $2 billion rise in the tax paying of the refugees. The refugees pay of $2 billion tax worldwide when you only use $4 million to settle.
So do you think this tax money is better for the developing country or developed countries?
This is in the developed country.
Oh, so you're saying that developed countries should be more developed after they are developed?
No, I'm saying because refugees go into the developed country, they could actually benefit the economy better.
Yes. The same reason applies to developing country, right? If we give the money to them and they can stay in the developing country.
The developing countries are already overpopulated. How do you expect them to take in more
They
refugees?
are overpopulated, but what our saying is that we will offer them a place which they can get the financial aid. And as our statistics shows that for every $1
The refugees doesn't need financial aid. They need a place to resettle. They need a life.
I want to explain is we have a special zone there for them, and for every $1 money that being invested on them, it will generate a 2.13 increase in the GDP. Therefore, this shows that our plan of resettling refugees not only to the developing country but also developed country actually works.
Okay, I have my question now.
Yes, yes.
So exactly what kind of restrictions are you planning on keeping or re-enhancing?
The restriction we talked about, the mainly first, the security check, because we believe this is a way to protect national security. And the second is the quota, and it serves as a guideline to disallocate those people into different regions, but not all flow into one region.
Can I have a follow-up?
Yes,
so
please.
how is the security check different from foreign nationals entering developed country if they want to travel?
As I mentioned before, according to Canadian Free Beacon, for all those refugees they enter in this country, they will go through the extra and more onerous security check, which is not the same treatment as other foreign nationals. Therefore, this is a restriction.
Exactly why are you putting in more restrictions on the refugees?
Because, as I illustrate in my rebuttal, because many of them are disguised as the refugee, but they are actually economic migrants. If we do not put a restriction, their home country where refugees are from, their benefit will be harmed. Therefore, we propose a restriction and the basic restriction. Thank you.
Ready? Okay, the summary speech starts now. Okay, first of all, I would like to go back to our framework because our president seems to be fixating on the issue that we have to prove a no border argument. But my partner has mentioned that we have three clear reasons of why we have no burden to do that. Because firstly, ground and topic intent, and also literature, which means that the con would have absolutely no arguments if we had to defend the restrictions. And also about the definition of restrictions, our opponents have actually conceded to our definition, which means that the restriction could be defined as more than foreign nationals. However, if I'm a citizen and I'm going to the U.S., I have to apply for a visa, and the U.S. government will check me for if I'm a terrorist, but that would not, like, vetting is vetting. There's no difference between like a more strict one or a normal foreign national entering the countries. So they're actually agreeing with us on the restriction restriction argument. So going back to the resolution. Refugee restrictions are permissible, which the word "are" in that indicates the status quo. They have not defended that. They have not defended the status quo, which they are actually eliminating some restrictions under the status quo. And also about the economy argument, my partner has mentioned that the refugees create $229 billion annually, compared to which is a very large number compared to the cost of resettling them. Also, our opponents have provided absolutely no solvency. They're only stating that the some refugees stay in the developed countries, and the majority of the refugees stay in the developing countries. So they have no feasible solvency for this refugee crisis right now, and therefore we think we win. Thank you.
Ready? Opponents ready? So both side summary time starts now. There are 3 points I'd like to address my summary. First, focus on the contentions. They mention in the framework, they mention the current restrictions are not permissible. However, first, they failed to prove the unnecessity of the refugee restrictions. And second, they didn't rebut our restrictions, which means that first, they agree with us that our refugee restrictions are permissible, and second, they are fight against their own framework. And move to the next point, they mention about developing nations host most refugees. I can explain that. The short distance enable these refugees to travel safely, and second, the similar culture enable them to adjust well in developing nations. However, and I also want to mention points. According to the Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has the right to pursue their happiness and freedom, which means that the refugees have their own rights to choose where they want to go. Our side, we just prove that the restrictions are permissible. However, there's actually no connection between our opponent, they can't judge because developing nations host the most refugees, so developed nations shouldn't have the restrictions. There's no logical connection. And they mention international law and they want to help the refugees. I agree with that because we still help them, but we just help them in a better way. We can actually guarantee the safety and the self-interest for refugees, for governments, and for local citizens in every nation. Just think about it. The economic refugees, they are not facing the fatal situations. So why developed nations should let them in? They leave the families. So our pro side, we actually went on the benefits points, the humanitarian points, and the framework, even according to our opponent's framework. And also, we went on the logical line. So we urge a pro-balance. Thank you.
Jerry's ready? Opponent's ready?
Yep.
Okay, time starts now. Okay, I believe I have the first question. Can you please define what is refugee under your framework?
Refugee is the person who are being persecuted and flee out of their country. Yes.
So how come economic migrants are relative? You just mentioned 80%.
Yeah, yes. The situation here is the thing. Because those people are refugees, but most of them use the title of the refugee. They're disguised of the refugee, but actually they're not refugee. But if we have no restrictions, we have no way to distinguish between them, which will harm the economy in the back country of the refugees.
You mentioned they disguise, right? So you aren't identifying them as refugees.
No, because as I stated before, they will go through more onerous and extra, not only security check, but also background check. This will clearly show that who are who. Therefore, this is the best way to differentiate them, which can protect both interests, which is host country and the home nation where refugees are from.
And how come this is different from applying to visa in a foreign country? They will still do a background check. If they find out that you might have a possibility of becoming a terrorist, they still won't accept your application.
As I mentioned in my rebuttal, you mentioned that for every treatment that different as the foreign nationals should be considered restriction. Therefore, according to Canadian Free Beacon, refugees will go through an extra and more onerous security check conducted by 3 governmental departments. This is clearly a restriction. Now, can we move on to our question?
Yeah. Yes.
So you talked about the refugees, you talked about the economic benefit, but which country do you think deserve this tax money? Is it the developed country or developing countries?
We've never said we aren't letting refugees into developing country. We're saying the developed country have a better capacity and have a bigger capacity of taking in refugees.
I just mean that the money and the benefit brought by the refugee should go to the developed country or developing country.
You can't simply think of the benefits. You have to outweigh the benefits and the disadvantages. The refugee will cause more disadvantage in the developing country.
But the disadvantage for refugees to travel long distance is most of them die along the way. Therefore, they do not.
The reason exactly why the refugees are dying on the way is because there are too implement restrictions under the status quo.
As I mentioned before, restrictions is just security check. We do not forbid them from coming, but just we do not encourage them because we understand that all the refugees, after they go through the trip, most of them will die along the way. And also, due to the different language and cultural background, they are less likely to get the job. We want all the refugees in the world to get a dignified job and have their dignity in the developing nations.
So again, you're actually agreeing with us because you are actually eliminating some kind of restrictions from the status quo, which means that you're actually taking the con stance.
We do not agree that. What we agree is restrictions should be permissible because for all my restrictions listed, you never attack any of my restrictions. And for all these restrictions, they are all beneficial to the refugees and also the home nations. Okay, can we move on to your question?
Yes, you mentioned a better way of the developed country helping the refugees. Can you elaborate? What is the better way? Where are the refugees living now?
As I mentioned before, according to the roster news, we will put the refugees into a special zone, and for every $1 that invested
Where
on
are
the
they living?
There is no clear link between
finish?
GDP increase and refugees.
Judge ready? My opponent's ready? Okay, my time starts now. Judge, my opponents and I are living in different worlds. Judge, my opponents are living in a world where refugees are living in the developing country and their human rights, basic human rights, are being invaded. There is only a 1% education rate, according to the UNHCR, of the refugees. And 80% of the refugees are women and children, which are in need of these basic human rights. So under their world, these basic human rights are being invaded. They're saying like refugees die on the way. That is exactly what we're trying to avoid. Because of the restrictions now, refugees are dying on the way while they're commuting from their home country to the developed country that they're trying to go. And they're saying they don't have to defend the status quo, but they never provided a solvency. So that is why our status quo still stands. However, Judge, under our world, because of specialization on the jobs, the refugees will go into the developed country and take up the jobs that the local people do not or is incapable of doing. And the developed country are escaping from their moral and legal obligations because they aren't taking enough while they have the capacity to do so. Refugees will go through vettings to make sure that they aren't carrying parasites or viruses that would cause a problem to the developed country, and that is the vetting that we are enhancing, or we are restricting them again, because as they mentioned, national interests will always be prioritized, and that is exactly what we're promoting for. We are making sure that the native people and the refugee will receive the maximum amount of benefit after they come into the country. We provide valid evidence that the refugees will create an increase in the local GDP and economy rise after they go into the country because of specialization. And when the refugees go into the developed country, they will actually receive a better chance of education and economy and overall life. So I think that if you invite the refugees or you lessen restrictions to keep them in a developed country, you actually give them a chance to resettle a life instead of just letting them live in inhumane places.
I'd like to take 2 minutes of my prep time. So judges ready? Opponents ready? My final focus starts now. Okay, first, judge about the framework. Our opponents just keep telling you that they will not prove there's no border restriction. But actually, the restriction, they themselves have already agreed that some basic and minimal and reasonable restrictions should be permissible. Therefore, if all the restrictions that are permissible, are reasonable, should be permissible. And now let's move on. Our opponents talks about what is kind of restrictions. And after I stated several times, according to Canadian Free Beacon, refugees will go through extra and more onerous security check, which is different from the foreign nationals. So we win their burden. We can prove that those restrictions are real restrictions. Now let's move on. Today, the biggest voting issue, I believe, is the saving all parties that be involved. Don't let our opponents confound you. Firstly, they tell you that all the refugees are women and children, and now they tell you that we use without restriction, we encourage them to go. First of all, if all of them do not speak this language, how can they get a proper job and the education they propose in their final focus? And then we believe we are the one that benefit the most parties being involved, because the two restrictions I propose, they never give us any response. The first is security check, because we want to differentiate the people who are refugee and economic migrants. Therefore, we want to protect the interests of the refugees where they're from. So if all the highly educated people are disguised as refugees and go to other countries, this will cause a backlash in the home country's economy. And the second is about save those people's lives. Because as I mentioned before, all those people, because of the no restriction, will encourage them to go. And as a responsible and reasonable developed nations, we do not saying that we forbid them from going, but we do not encourage them to go. Because first, the language and cultural barriers, as I mentioned before, they will not get the job, which our opponents fail to give us any response. And the second is because of the longer distance of the shipping, those refugees are actually die along the way. Therefore, I believe provide them the job and the better healthcare in the developing nation is better than risk of risking their life to go to the developed countries. And furthermore, my plan, which is every $1 invest will cost increasing the GDP. Thank you.
那我们这次感谢两队选手的精彩表现，请同学们收拾一下，稍微回座位，先回座位休息一下。我们马上开始颁奖典礼，然后会公布比赛结果。那么我们在等待裁判最后评分的同时呢，和大家说明一下，我们本次的长沙赛区第2轮的联赛，包括公共论坛式的辩论新手组、公共论坛式辩论的公开组，还有原创演讲的比赛，全部都结束了。那么在这2天的比赛中呢，我们也看到有很多外地同学，有很多长沙同学都非常的不错。尤其是这些同学呢，我知道他们在参加比赛之前都花了很多的时间准备，不管是演讲还是辩论，这都是花了很多时间在他们日常学业很忙碌的基础上。所以呢，不管最终的比赛结果如何，我相信大家首先是在这个准备的过程中获得了很多的学习和成长。那么在比赛的过程中呢，也认识了很多志同道合的小伙伴，得到了很多这种结识新朋友的机会，然后去看到优秀的同龄人都在怎么样去展现自己的一个场合。所以呢，不管结果如何，我们还没有公布结果，我们首先恭喜每一位同学完成了这样一个比赛，强度是非常大的。那么裁判们还需要时间，在最后颁奖典礼正式开始之前呢，我还想感谢一下我们长郡中学国际部。从几个月前我们开始准备，长郡的老师一直都在积极的和我们联系，然后做很多周边的工作。我虽然比赛只有2天，但准备时间其实是1到2个月这样一个时间周期里面进行的。所以感谢我们长郡的老师。首先，这个胡颂国际部主任胡主任已经来到现场。他等会会为大家为获奖同学们颁奖。另外后面还有我们长郡的这个学术校长 Academic Principal Mr. Andrew Saunders， 他也会为大家颁奖。另外我们还有很多老师，这个在忙的胡老师，后面坐着的吴老师，还有那个倩倩老师，还有薇薇老师，还有那个雅玲老师，他们可能都还在忙。 很感谢各位老师牺牲这么多时间。那么同时呢，还有我们的裁判 ，Thank you all the judges for your commitment and your contribution. Your help is the most important thing of the big debate. Without your work, your feedback, your help with the students, the tournament will never be able to run in such smooth way. So thank you all the judges. 同时也要感谢我们各位陪同同学来的家长们啊，这个也是很辛苦的。好在这次长郡的这个校园呢，我们学校特别安排了允许家长进入可以陪同。以往正常来说家长是不可以进校园的，所以呢，家长虽然能陪同，但是这2天还是很消耗人的，因为周末本身学生们可能都有课，都有其他活动，家长也有自己的很多事情。那么这个花这么多时间也在支持孩子们的这个喜欢的事情，所以也再次感谢各位的家长的一个陪同和支持。